I used to think betrayal had a sound, a slammed door, a whispered phone call, maybe a lipstick-stained coffee cup left in the wrong place. Turns out, I was wrong. Betrayal is completely silent, right up until the moment your entire life collapses in front of your eyes. If someone had told me that by sunset I'd be watching police cars fill my driveway while my wife screamed that I'd ruined everything, I would have laughed in their face. I trusted her. That was my first mistake. Real quick, if stories like this remind you that character always matters in the end, consider subscribing. It helps the channel, and I've got a lot more unbelievable experiences to share. Anyway, here's what happened. My name is Ryan. I'm 56 years old, live just outside Columbus, Ohio, and until last fall I believed I'd had a pretty ordinary life. 28 years married, one daughter, a paid-off house, a dog that was getting too old to chase squirrels. Nothing glamorous, but it was ours. Or at least, I thought it was. My wife, Melissa, had always been the outgoing one. She could walk into a grocery store and somehow leave knowing 3 people's life stories. I was the opposite. I liked routine. Coffee at 6. Work by 7:30. Dinner around 6. A baseball game on TV if the Reds were playing. Simple. Melissa used to say I was predictably dependable. At some point, that stopped being a compliment. It became an insult. She started making little comments. You've gotten boring. You never surprise me. You act like you're already retired. I'd laugh them off. 28 years of marriage changes people. I figured she was just going through one of those phases everyone talks about. Then the spending started. First it was new clothes. Nothing unusual. Then expensive perfume. Then salon appointments that somehow lasted 4 hours. Then a gym membership she'd never wanted before. When I complimented her one evening, she barely looked up from her phone. I'm doing this for me, she said. Not thank you. Not even a smile. Just, I'm doing this for me. Looking back, that sentence should have set off alarms. Instead, I apologized. Funny how the loyal spouse is always the one apologizing. A month later, she changed the password on her phone. Again, when I asked why, she rolled her eyes so hard I thought they'd get stuck. Ryan, couples who trust each other don't need to look through each other's phones. Fair enough. I never asked again. Because that's what trust looks like. Or so I believed. Around that same time, she started volunteering to run errands. Melissa hated errands. She'd rather pay extra than spend 30 minutes shopping. Suddenly, she loved grocery runs. Loved picking up dry cleaning. Loved driving across town for things we could have ordered online. Always dressed up. Always wearing that perfume. Always coming home smiling at her phone. I noticed. I just didn't want to believe what it looked like. Our daughter, Emily, noticed too. Dad, she called me one Sunday evening. I don't want to start drama, but Mom's acting weird. I remember defending Melissa. She's probably just trying something new. Emily got quiet. You always make excuses for her. That one hurt. Not because she was being disrespectful, because somewhere deep down, I knew she was right. The weirdest part wasn't the distance. It was Melissa's confidence. She wasn't nervous. She wasn't hiding. She acted like she couldn't possibly get caught. Like she had already convinced herself that whatever she was doing, she deserved it. She'd sit across from me at dinner texting under the table, smile at messages, then complain we never talked anymore. Think about that. She was texting someone else, while blaming me for the silence. That's a level of arrogance I still can't wrap my head around. One Friday night, I planned a surprise dinner. Reservations at the little steakhouse where we'd celebrated our 20th anniversary. I even bought flowers. She walked through the front door 40 minutes late. Took one look at the table, then sighed. I forgot. Forgot. Our anniversary dinner. Forgot. She grabbed her purse again before I could answer. I already made plans with Ashley. Ashley. I never met Ashley. Never saw Ashley. Never heard Ashley call. But somehow Ashley needed my wife almost every weekend. Funny how invisible friends always show up when someone's hiding something. She kissed the air somewhere near my cheek and left. I stood there holding flowers like an idiot. The dog was the only one happy to see me. That night I threw away a perfectly good steak. Not because I lost my appetite. Because every bite tasted like humiliation. A few days later something happened that changed everything. I was changing the oil in my truck when my neighbor, Carl, wandered over. Carl wasn't the gossiping type. Retired firefighter. Straight shooter. He leaned against my garage and scratched his beard. Ryan. Yeah. You mind if I ask you something? Go ahead. Everything okay between you and Melissa? I laughed. Why? He hesitated. I've seen a black SUV parked outside your place a few afternoons. I frowned. Probably a delivery. He shook his head. No. He looked uncomfortable. Guy stays about an hour, then leaves. Every Tuesday. Every Thursday. Every Saturday. I felt my stomach drop. Still, I defended her. There has to be an explanation. Carl nodded slowly. I hope so. Then he looked me straight in the eye. But if I were you, I'd stop hoping and start paying attention. Those words echoed in my head for days. I wanted to ignore them. Instead, I started noticing everything. The late-night showers. The hidden smiles. The sudden obsession with locking doors. The way she'd turn her phone face down whenever I walked into the room. One evening, she came home laughing. Actually laughing. I hadn't heard that laugh directed at me in years. When she realized I was watching, it disappeared instantly. What's so funny? Oh, just a meme. She clutched her phone tighter. Funny. She never showed me the meme. That was the night I stopped lying to myself. I didn't know who the other man was. I didn't know how long it had been happening. But for the first time, I admitted something I should have admitted months earlier. My wife wasn't drifting away. She was already gone. And I had no idea just how ugly the truth was about to become. The next morning, I did something I'd never done in 28 years of marriage. I called in sick. Not because I was sick. Because I couldn't concentrate on a single thing anymore. Carl's words kept replaying in my head. Stop hoping and start paying attention. For years, I convinced myself that trust meant ignoring your instincts. Now I wondered if I'd been confusing trust with denial. Melissa left the house a little after 8. She was dressed nicer than usual for someone who claimed she was just grabbing coffee and running errands. A new blouse. Designer sunglasses. The perfume she'd started wearing almost every day. She barely looked at me before walking out. Don't wait up for dinner, she said casually. I might meet Ashley. Ashley again. The invisible friend. The woman who somehow always needed Melissa exactly when I did. I waited 10 minutes after she pulled away before getting into my truck. My palms were sweating so badly, I nearly dropped my keys. Part of me hoped I'd lose her in traffic. That would give me an excuse to go home and pretend none of this was happening. Instead, every light seemed to work in my favor. I stayed several cars behind her. Far enough not to be obvious. Close enough not to lose sight of her silver SUV. She didn't head toward the shopping center. She didn't drive to the coffee shop she usually mentioned. She drove downtown, straight into an office district. Then she pulled into the parking lot of a small cafe. I parked across the street. Within 2 minutes, a dark pickup rolled into the lot. A man stepped out. Tall, maybe mid-40s. Athletic build. Ball cap. He looked around before smiling the second he spotted Melissa. Not the smile you'd give a coworker. The kind of smile you save for someone you've been waiting to see. She smiled back. Then she walked right into his arms. Not a polite hug. A long embrace. Comfortable. Familiar. My chest tightened. I couldn't hear a word they said. I didn't need to. Body language tells the truth long before words do. They laughed together like two teenagers. He opened the cafe door for her. She touched his arm as they walked inside. That tiny gesture hurt more than I expected. She hadn't reached for my arm in years. I sat there for nearly an hour. I told myself to drive away, to confront her, to march inside and demand answers. Instead, I stayed frozen behind the steering wheel. Eventually, they came back out. He kissed her forehead. She leaned into him. Then they drove away in separate vehicles. I didn't follow this time. I already had the answer I'd been avoiding. It wasn't proof of everything, but it was enough to know I wasn't imagining things anymore. When Melissa got home that evening, she acted like nothing had happened. Busy day? She asked while hanging up her purse. You could say that. She nodded absent-mindedly. I had lunch with Ashley. The lie came so naturally that it almost impressed me. No hesitation. No guilt. Nothing. Just another sentence. I looked at her for a long moment. How's Ashley doing? She shrugged. Oh, you know. Same old stuff. She couldn't even invent a believable story. She'd become so confident that she assumed I'd never question her. That realization stung almost as much as the betrayal itself. Over the next week, I stopped asking questions. That seemed to make her even more comfortable. If she came home late, I didn't mention it. If she disappeared for hours, I simply nodded. Inside, though, something had changed. I wasn't ignoring the signs anymore. I was collecting them. Receipts. Dates. Times. Little inconsistencies. Nothing dramatic. Just enough to piece together the puzzle. One evening Emily called again. You sound tired, Dad. I haven't been sleeping much. She was quiet for a moment. Then she asked the question I'd been dreading. Is Mom seeing someone? I stared out the kitchen window. For several seconds, I couldn't answer. Finally, I said, I think she might be. Emily sighed. I was afraid you'd say that. You knew? I didn't know, but I had a feeling. She hesitated again. Can I tell you something without making you angry? Always. I saw Mom with a guy about a month ago. Everything inside me went still. Where? Outside a bookstore. What happened? I was driving by. They were standing really close together. She paused. I told myself I was overthinking it. You should have told me. I know. I didn't want to be wrong. Neither of us spoke for a while. Finally, she said softly, whatever happens, Dad, don't let her convince you this is somehow your fault. Those words stayed with me. Because if you've ever been betrayed, you know that's exactly what often comes next. Saturday afternoon, Melissa announced she was leaving again. Girls' spa day. I smiled. Have fun. She looked surprised. No questions. No. She narrowed her eyes for just a second, almost disappointed. Then she left. The moment her car disappeared around the corner, Carl walked over from next door with 2 cups of coffee. You look like hell. I feel worse. He handed me a cup. You gonna tell me what's going on? I took a long drink before answering. I followed her. He didn't look shocked. What did you find? A guy. Carl nodded slowly. I'm sorry. I haven't confronted her. Good. I looked at him. Good. You confront someone when you've got emotions. He took a sip of coffee. You make decisions when you've got facts. That might have been the smartest thing anyone had said to me all week. I realized then that charging into an argument wouldn't help me. If my marriage was truly over, I needed to think clearly, not angrily. Carl stood to leave. Before walking away, he stopped. Ryan. Yeah. I've seen enough house fires to know something. What's that? Most of the damage happens after the first spark. I watched him walk home. At the time, I thought he was talking about marriage. Later, I'd realize he was talking about something much bigger, because within 48 hours, I was about to learn who that man really was. And his name would change everything. I barely slept that night. The name kept echoing in my head. Derek Lawson. At first, it was just another name. A stranger. A man who'd somehow found his way into my marriage. But by sunrise, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to him than I knew. Monday morning, I sat in my truck outside the hardware store where I'd worked for almost 19 years. I stared at the steering wheel instead of walking inside. Nothing felt normal anymore. Every customer I'd ever helped. Every paycheck I'd ever earned. Every overtime shift I'd worked so Melissa could have the vacation she wanted. It all suddenly felt like it had been for someone who no longer existed. Around lunchtime, my phone buzzed. It was Carl. Meet me after work. His voice sounded unusually serious. Everything okay? I think I found something. That evening, Carl was waiting on his back porch with 2 folding chairs and a manila folder. I wasn't trying to snoop, he said. But that truck looked familiar. He slid a printed photo across the table. It was the same black pickup I'd seen outside the cafe. You know him? I asked. Carl nodded slowly. I've seen him around before. Years ago. He explained that Derek had worked construction with one of Carl's cousins for a short time. He never stayed anywhere long. Why? Carl hesitated. There was always some kind of trouble. The word trouble stuck with me. What kind of trouble? I don't know all the details. He leaned back. But I remember hearing something about unpaid debts and someone looking for him. That wasn't proof of anything. Still, it was enough to convince me that this wasn't just an ordinary affair. Something felt off. Something Melissa either didn't know or didn't care about. Over the next few days, Melissa became bolder. She stopped pretending to explain where she'd been. If she came home 2 hours late, she'd simply say, I lost track of time. If I asked with whom, she'd shrug. Why does it matter? That sentence told me everything. She wasn't afraid of getting caught anymore. She thought she was untouchable. One Friday evening, she walked into the kitchen, tossed her keys onto the counter, and announced, I'm going away next weekend. Where? A girls' cabin trip. No husbands. No phones. No interruptions. She smiled while saying it, almost like she was daring me to question her. Instead, I smiled back. Sounds fun. For the first time in weeks. She looked confused. She expected an argument. She expected me to beg. Instead, I gave her absolutely nothing. And sometimes, silence makes people far more uncomfortable than anger. By the time Melissa packed her suitcase the following Friday, She thought she had every detail under control. She had no idea that someone else was already watching Derek, and they weren't interested in saving my marriage. By Friday afternoon, Melissa had her suitcase packed and sitting by the front door. She looked happier than I'd seen her in months. That should have hurt. Instead, it gave me clarity. People don't glow like that when they're leaving for a girls' weekend. They glow when they're convinced they've gotten away with something. She walked into the kitchen wearing jeans, a white sweater, and those expensive boots she'd insisted were on sale. "You'll be okay by yourself?" she asked. It was almost funny. For weeks, she'd barely acknowledged I existed, and now she suddenly cared whether I'd survive 2 nights alone. "I'll manage." She smiled. "Good." Then she kissed me on the cheek. It was cold, mechanical, like checking a box on a to-do list. The second her SUV disappeared down the street, I sat in silence for almost 5 minutes. Then my phone buzzed. "Carl, you still home?" "Yeah." "Come outside." He was standing in his driveway, staring toward the road Melissa had just taken. "You following her?" he asked. I shook my head. "No." He looked surprised. "I already know where she's going." That wasn't entirely true. I knew she wasn't going to a cabin. I just didn't know where she was really headed. "I've spent weeks chasing answers," I said. "I'm done chasing." Carl nodded. "Sometimes that's the smartest move." Before heading back inside, he said something that stuck with me. People who think they're smarter than everyone else eventually make careless mistakes. I had no idea how right he was. Around 6 that evening, Emily called. "Did Mom leave already?" "About an hour ago." There was a pause. "Dad, I need to tell you something." My stomach tightened. "What is it?" I didn't want to say anything until I was sure. She took a deep breath. "I saw Mom's car yesterday." "Where?" "Outside a townhouse." I didn't interrupt. I thought maybe she was visiting someone. But she stayed there for almost 3 hours. "How do you know?" "I had an appointment nearby." She hesitated. "And I saw her walk out with the same man." The room felt strangely quiet. "What did they do?" "They looked." She searched for the right word. "Comfortable. Not nervous. Not secretive. Comfortable. Like 2 people who'd stopped worrying about getting caught." Emily's voice softened. "I'm sorry. You don't have to apologize. I just don't want you blindsided." "I won't be." At least, that's what I told her. Saturday morning was unusually peaceful. I made coffee, fed the dog, sat on the back porch. For the first time in weeks, my mind wasn't racing. I'd reached a point where the truth mattered more than the marriage. Around 10 o'clock, my phone rang. Unknown number. Normally, I'd ignore it. This time I answered. "Mr. Carter?" "Speaking." "My name is Detective Alvarez." Every muscle in my body tensed. "I'm sorry to bother you. I just have a couple of questions." My first thought was that something had happened to Melissa. Instead, the detective asked, "Do you know a man named Derek Lawson?" There it was again. That name. "Why?" "We believe he may be using multiple addresses around the county." My pulse quickened. "I'm not sure I understand." "I'm not asking you to do anything. We're simply trying to confirm whether you've ever seen him." The detective described him. Same height, same truck, same ball cap, same man. I answered carefully. "I've seen someone matching that description." "Recently?" "Yes." There was a brief silence. "Thank you. If we need anything further, we'll contact you." The call ended. I stared at my phone. Carl had been right. This wasn't just about an affair anymore. Something much bigger was happening. That evening, Melissa texted me. "Having a wonderful time with the girls. Signal is terrible, LOL." She even attached a photo. For wine glasses. A fireplace. A cozy cabin. At first glance, it looked convincing. Then I noticed something. Only 3 reflections appeared in the window behind the glasses. One of them was unmistakably a man. She hadn't even realized he'd been caught in the reflection. I zoomed in. You couldn't make out a face, but you could clearly see broad shoulders and a baseball cap. I leaned back in my chair. For weeks, she'd acted like she was always one step ahead. Now she'd made her first real mistake, and she didn't even know it. She came home Sunday evening humming to herself. The suitcase rolled through the hallway. She looked relaxed, refreshed, almost triumphant. "Miss me?" she asked. I smiled politely. "How was the cabin?" "It was amazing." "What did you girls do?" "Oh, you know." She laughed, talked, drank wine, stayed up too late. Every answer came effortlessly, like she'd rehearsed it. Then she looked me straight in the eye and asked, "You believe me, don't you?" For just a second, I almost laughed. Instead, I simply said, "I believe people eventually show you exactly who they are." Her smile faded. just for a moment. Then she picked up her suitcase and walked upstairs. She had no idea that the next knock on our front door wouldn't be from a neighbor. And it wouldn't be for me. The knock came at 8:17 Tuesday morning. Not one knock. 3. Firm. Confident. The kind that tells you whoever's outside isn't asking for permission. Melissa looked up from her coffee. You expecting someone? I shrugged. No. I opened the front door. 2 detectives stood on the porch. Behind them sat 2 unmarked SUVs. Mr. Carter? That's me. We'd like to ask you a few questions. Melissa appeared in the hallway. The second one of the detectives looked past me, his expression changed. There she is. Every bit of color disappeared from Melissa's face. What's going on? The older detective stepped forward. Ma'am, we'd like to speak with you regarding Derek Lawson. She forced a laugh. I think you've got the wrong person. The detective didn't even blink. No, Mrs. Carter. We're quite certain we don't. For the first time in weeks. She looked scared. Not guilty. Scared. The detectives explained that Derek had been under investigation for months in connection with a multi-state fraud operation. Fake contracting companies. Stolen identities. Forged insurance claims. He had been moving from city to city, using different names and different addresses. One of those addresses was the townhouse Emily had seen. Melissa kept insisting she barely knew him. We only met a few times. The younger detective opened a folder. That's interesting. He laid several photographs on the kitchen table. There was Melissa, walking hand in hand with Derek, getting into his truck, having dinner, checking into a lakeside resort. Different dates, different outfits, months apart. Her shoulders dropped. She realized they already knew everything. Then came the question that changed the entire morning. Mrs. Carter, did Mr. Lawson ever ask you to hold money for him? Silence. A long silence. She looked at me, then back at the detective. Maybe. How much? I don't know. Try. She whispered. 30,000. I honestly thought I'd misheard her. $30,000. The detective asked where it came from. She claimed Derek told her it was from a business deal. She never asked questions. The detective nodded slowly. Unfortunately for you, that money belongs to several elderly fraud victims. The kitchen fell silent. Melissa covered her mouth. No, I didn't know. The detective's voice stayed calm. Whether you knew or not is something the court can determine. At that exact moment, her phone started ringing. Derek, his name flashed across the screen. Everyone saw it. The detective simply held out his hand. Answer it. She looked terrified. I put it on speaker. With shaking hands, she accepted the call. Derek. His voice came through immediately. Pack a bag. We need to leave. Now. Melissa looked at the detectives. She couldn't speak. He continued. They've been asking questions. I think somebody talked. If you're still at your husband's house, get out before they. The detective reached over and ended the call. Nobody said a word. One officer quietly spoke into his radio. Within minutes, every available unit in the area had Derek's location. 3 hours later, Carl knocked on my door. You here? I nodded. They got him. Pulled over less than 20 miles away. He'd tried running. Didn't get far. The truck was full of fake IDs, cash, forged documents, and electronics purchased with stolen money. Carl whistled. Hell of a guy your wife picked. I couldn't even answer. Because I wasn't thinking about Derek. I was thinking about the woman I'd spent 28 years believing I knew. The divorce was surprisingly quick. Melissa wanted half of everything. Her attorney argued she deserved it. Until the financial records came out. Bank transfers. Hidden accounts. Money she'd quietly moved over the previous year. The judge wasn't impressed. He ruled that those hidden transactions would be considered during the property division. She walked into court expecting a payday. She walked out with far less than she'd imagined. Months later, I heard she'd sold most of her jewelry to pay legal fees. The designer handbags she'd loved so much? Gone. The luxury SUV? Sold. The friends who encouraged her to live her best life? They disappeared almost overnight. Funny how people love drama. Until the consequences arrive. One afternoon, almost a year later, I ran into her at the grocery store. She looked older. Not because of age. Because stress changes people. She saw me and walked over. I made the biggest mistake of my life. I believed her. I miss us. I believe that too. Then she asked the question I never expected. Do you think someday you could forgive me? I looked at her for a long moment. Not with anger. Not with hate. Just honesty. I forgave you months ago. Hope appeared in her eyes. Then I finished. But forgiveness doesn't mean I have to give you another chance. She nodded. Tears filled her eyes. For once, she had nothing to argue, nothing to blame, no excuse left. She quietly walked away. And that was the last time I ever saw her. People always ask whether Derek ruined my marriage. He didn't. He only revealed what was already broken. The person who destroyed my marriage wasn't the man she chose. It was the woman who believed I'd never find out. Losing her felt like losing half my life. But looking back, I didn't lose my future that day. I got it back. Looking back, I don't think losing my marriage was the worst thing that happened to me. The worst thing was realizing I'd spent years loving someone who had already stopped respecting me. But here's the strange part. The day she walked out of my life wasn't the day I lost everything. It was the day I finally stopped losing myself. And if there's one lesson I've taken from all of this, it's simple. Never ignore the small lies just because you're afraid of the big truth.